Straight talk from Israel. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
Welcome to Beyond the Matrix with Rod Bryant and Jerry Gordon. Here on Israel News Talk Radio. Unplug, strap yourself in, because you are about to move beyond the Matrix.
This is Jerry Gordon, producer and co-host of Israel News Talk Radio Beyond the Matrix. We have an amazing interview today with a frequent guest on our program. That's American expat in Paris, Nidra Pauler. It's about the aftermath of the beheading of a revered French school teacher, teaching his students about civic rights and using the infamous Charlie Hebdo cartoons. He was beheaded by an 18-year-old Chechen immigrant who brought his family in on what we call chain immigration from Russia. And this has produced an enormous upswelling of resentment and protests all throughout France, particularly because it's aimed at the secular education system, which is revered in France, particularly after the Dreyfus affair of the late 19th, early 20th century. Nidra has been in the forefront of not only this story, but also those trials that are going on now about the Charlie Hebdo accomplices and the killings not only of the editorial staff, but also of 4 Jews who were hostages in the January 2015 massacres at Charlie Hebdo and the hostage taking at the Kosher supermarket near Paris. The government has gone out of its way to support French outrage about what has occurred and the tolerance of Islamism inside the Republic. Add to that the outrage expressed towards Turkey's Erdogan for calling for a boycott of France and President Macron as mentally defective. This is all happening in the wake of the beheading of the late Samuel Paty on October the 16th.
Israel is located in one of the most volatile areas in the world. Israel is an island of stability in a sea of war and unrest. In the midst of this turmoil, Israel stands out as a beacon of order and human progress. Each week we update you on what's happening in this, the Jewish state, a true light unto the nations. This is Jay Shapiro. Join me every Thursday on Israel News Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Beyond the Matrix, here on Israel News Talk Radio.
Good day. We're here with famous American expat, journalist, author of note, intrepid journalist, Nidra Pauler, in her lair in a section of Paris, which we will leave unidentified. I am, of course, Jerry Gordon. I am the producer and co-host of Israel News Talk Radio, Beyond the Matrix, among other things. And we are dedicating this program to our sidekick, who is unfortunately down with COVID-19. So Nidra, a lot of things are going on in Paris these days. Islamic terrorism has once again been triggered by the Charlie Hebdo cartoons used in the class by a French high school teacher, Samuel Paty, that resulted in his grisly beheading by a Chechen asylee in a Paris suburb. What are the facts about the crime? And what do we know about the 18-year-old perpetrator shot dead by police?
Yes. First of all, it's not high school, it's middle school or junior high school, called collège in France, in a very, Conflans-Sainte-Honorine. It's a very beautiful, leafy suburb, right? Quiet residential place. What happened is that all teachers in France are required to give courses in civics, and that includes classes on freedom of speech. And in that context, Samuel Paty, like many other professors, raised the question of the Mohammed cartoons, called caricature in French. This happened just a few weeks ago. And the father of a 13-year-old who was technically in the class came and complained and said that this was terrible and that it was an insult to Muslims, and claimed that the teacher asked the Muslim students to raise their hands, identify themselves, and leave the classroom to not be shocked. And then he said his daughter refused to leave and she was shot. It turns out that his daughter had been expelled. She wasn't in the class, she was expelled for bad behavior and absenteeism. This father, who's already being recognized as a full-time agitator, started a whole campaign against this professor with the help of an even bigger agitator, Mohammed Sefoui, of Moroccan origin, who created the Sheikh Yassin brigades in France, an association, and was a known agitator, anti-Semitic, anti-Zionist, and also fighting against, for example, any kind of rapprochement between Muslims and the greater French society. And he mounted a whole operation against Imam Shamduni, who is very internationally known for his friendship with the Jewish community, trips to Israel and presence at all main big events concerning the Jewish community. So it wasn't like there was some immediate reaction because the professor showed the cartoons. This was prepared and fomented, and there were endless videos, complaints, visits to the school, accusations. And finally, the professor made a complaint to the police against this father for defamation. There were meetings in the school. Apparently, the principal was more or less helpful to the professor, not running against him. Not so much is known yet about the Chechen who beheaded the professor. He has a 10-year residence permit. He's here with his family. They were granted asylum on appeal after it was refused the first time. And of course, the police are looking to find out if there's a direct connection between those that made the whole operation against the professor and the one who actually carried out the beheading. There are, I think, 16 people held for questioning at this time. One little detail, this Chechen went to the school, was hanging around near the end of the day, asking the pupils to identify the professor, and apparently gave money to one or more of the pupils to help him identify the professor. Some of these pupils are also being questioned right now. So the important thing is to know that this was not a spontaneous reaction. The Chechen was not in that school, never had been in that school, didn't live in that neighborhood. This was an operation that was carried out deliberately by known agitators. This agitator that I spoke of, the friend of the father, he was one of the big organizers of the 2014 worst demonstrations, riots against Jews. They tried to do a pogrom. They attacked synagogues. That was in 2014, defending Hamas against Israel. And of course, the question is raised now, how was he allowed to do this? He's been doing it for 15, 20 years.
So why did Paty's murder trigger such an overwhelming reaction throughout France, evident in the huge rallies in Paris and major cities this past Sunday?
Yes, even though people are very respectful in general of the rules of distance, and of course they were all wearing masks, the reaction was so intense. The Place de la République was totally filled all over the country. The people came out as they did in 2015. One thing, Jerry, it's a series of these reactions. 2013, 2015, it's an exasperation and also a will to show that people want to defend the country and don't want to put up with this anymore. It's not, there's no resignation at all, no acceptance and no resignation. The other reason is because school is sort of almost sacred in France. But the French education system is what makes people from all origins become French citizens. And there's a long-standing respect for teachers. The irony is that if you look back 20 years, many French teachers were anti-Zionist and pro-Palestinian and voting for left and far left parties. But you see, there's a kind of construction of the defense against Islamization, and it goes by steps and stages. When it was only the Jews, there was not such a massive reaction, but that's normal. That's how it is, and that's how it works. And today, we can catch up with the beginnings of this Islamization and this jihad against France.
So what precipitated Monday's actions by the Ministry of the Interior to arrest and close French Muslim anti-Islamophobia organizations?
Yes. Well, of course, being against Islamophobia, as we well know, is being against the criticism of Islam and being against the defense of society against jihad. And that was clear to many of us for a long time. But this time, the government made some bold steps, and they're closing it. They are going to close other associations and other mosques. They immediately closed a mosque that had retransmitted the video against this school teacher. They retransmitted it, and that's it. They closed the mosque. You know, we have a new Minister of the Interior, Gérald Darmanin. He's Muslim, and he's the son of Harkis, the Harkis that took the side of France during the war, the revolution, liberation movement in Algeria. And he is very well placed to deal with this problem because as a Harki, he's victim of Muslim persecution of anybody that doesn't go along with Sharia. And as a French Muslim, he doesn't have any complex about doing what has to be done and saying what has to be said.
You mentioned earlier the perpetrator of something that got picked up in the press of the fatwa against Paty. And he has some connections, I gather, with a pro-Hamas.
Yes, he's the leader of it. He created it.
The head of it.
The Sher Yassin Association. His name is Mohammed, I'm sorry not to have it exactly, but it's like Seferi. And he's a dual national, and people are saying, why isn't he being deported? Let me tell you that the debate is so lively on French TV that you can hardly find that people are talking over each other, not in a hostile way. They're so filled with the exasperation and the feeling that it's time now to do what is clear and obvious to anyone in his right mind.
The Tamar Yona Show.
Tamar? She's sassy.
She's smart.
She's funny.
But she's also a real Jewish mother.
Hi, everybody. I'm Tamar Yona. And yes, I can be all of those things. But at Israel News Talk Radio, I'm here to bring you the news stories and guests that you may not hear anywhere else. Join me live on air Sundays, Mondays, and Tuesdays for the most unique and bold talk radio in Israel.
The Tamar Yona Show.
Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Did you know this psalm and many others were composed by a Jewish shepherd and musician who later became a king? Would you like to know some of the inner meanings of psalms to help you connect with God and strengthen your soul? An exciting and easy-to-read book is now available which will help you do just that. Software for the Soul, Psalms for Everyone, available on Kindle, Audible, and Amazon.com. Software for the Soul.
Welcome back to Beyond the Matrix, here on Israel News Talk Radio.
The investigating judge has stubbornly insisted that he's mentally unfit to be judged. There were 3 separate expertises on his psychological condition. The first one concluded that he was fit to stand trial and that his judgment was I can't remember how to say it in English. He didn't have his full capacity of judgment, but he was not, I'm sorry to say it in this vague way, he was not completely out of his mind. He knew what he was doing when he did it, okay? Nobody, in fact, claims he's not fit to stand trial because by this ridiculous, perverse process, he's mentally healthy before the murder. Then he goes berserk because he smokes a whole lot of marijuana, and then he's mentally normal after. And I think he was arrested, charged 20 times or 30 times. No, ever presented any defense of a psychological problem. So they keep on going back and back and back into court to try to get the investigating judge to back off and let him be tried in criminal court. And the Murray-Knoll case is much less complicated. The 2 guys, they're accused of anti-Semitism and they have all the evidence and it's more clear-cut. But the Halimi case, it's one of those, you notice that there's a moment of awareness over the beheading of this teacher. Well, there's a moment of blindness, exceptional blindness, after the killing of Sarah Halimi. And this will come up, and these arguments will be made, and they will get further and further into the mainstream from just the Jewish community being concerned. Well, we know that this goes back 20 years with the Aldura blood libel, and that led to this absolute explosion of anti-Semitism, especially in France, but everywhere in the world. And it continues to this day. In Black Lives Matter demonstrations, some of them were chanting, "Oh, Israel, we know you kill children too." And the whole connection between Black Lives Matter and anti-Zionism. So at the beginning, of course, the Jews felt alone and tried to explain that this would not stop with us. It's such a cliche that you don't even feel like saying it anymore. Now it's playing out. And I think I told you the other day when we were talking privately, if societies were geniuses, then every time something happens, they would understand and take measures and go back to normal, harmonious life. They aren't. They're like bumbling idiots. They're made up of us, which we're not geniuses, and we make endless mistakes. And so it goes that way, hobbling along. I feel that it's very important when it starts to go in the right direction, that it's very important to encourage that, to recognize it, to bring in our old stories, our evidence that was ignored, but to bring it in a very, I think, almost tender way, so that it can be accepted instead of creating another kind of refusal to see it. And now, of course, that's one of the things I'm working on.
There's been a surge in COVID-19 in France and other EU countries this fall. Tell us about what measures the Macron government is taking and how they impacting on you in Paris.
Every weekend, when I'm out in my neighborhood, I think of my family and friends in the United States, I think of my family and friends in the United States. I get the impression that they're in lockdown, voluntary lockdown, ever since March. I have people in my family haven't been to the supermarket, haven't seen their children. And I think, do they even imagine how our life is so close to normal? People out in the streets, shopping, going to the cafes, the restaurants, socializing, full of life. It's also quite amusing to see how the Parisians have adapted to masks, because at first it's very strange for us to wear masks, not like in Asian countries. And now everybody wears masks. Some exceptions, but very small exceptions. Everybody's wearing masks. And I guess in the civilized parts of the city, I can't say I go everywhere. Okay, so our spike is coming from the low level. We were almost down close to 0 deaths this summer. My understanding of the pandemic, of the coronavirus, is that it is similar to the Spanish flu 100 years ago, and it will not just go away. It's going to be around for probably another year. And the question is how to live with it. We don't do like at the time of the Spanish flu, just the people they had to let them die. They couldn't do anything about it. That's not possible today. So here's what's happening. The government is trying to keep a handle on everything and take measures step by step as things go. As the peak goes up, then they take new measures to try to get it down. So right now we have a curfew from 9 p.m. to 6 a.m. It's, the restaurants are very unhappy because they wanted it to start at 11. But the point of the curfew in the evening is, it's two things. One is they have to let people go to work because the economy needs that, and the children to go to school. But in the evening, that's when they feel that people socialize and they are the most likely to forget about keeping distance from each other. And they don't wear masks because they're eating and drinking. And that's why they did it. So the other night, Sunday night, I was coming home, got home 10 minutes before curfew. And you see the people scurrying around to the takeout places to get their dinner in time. And then gradually, the streets emptying. With some exceptions, people just accept it. There's a tremendous criticism of the government. knowing and following what's happening in the United States, I think that people here should applaud the government and thank their stars, lucky stars, to have a government that's responsible, clear-minded, rational, and cool. We don't have a political thing about the masks, except for a few people that are influenced by the United States. I don't think that they've done so badly, and I think that they could have done better, and everybody is trying. But look at the case of Israel. When I first wrote about the pandemic and what was happening in Israel, I saw it, I wrote about it as a country that's like a Jewish mother. And the idea was that nobody should die. And there were, something like 300 fatal fatalities. And everybody was talking about Sweden. Our conservative friends, were writing about Sweden. Look at Sweden, they're doing all right. They don't lock down. And Sweden had thousands of deaths. It's about the same population as Israel. And then suddenly, it just got out of hand in Israel. Now they're past 2,000. So I think that it's foolish to condemn and congratulate at this stage. We really don't know enough of what's happening and what's going to happen. I do listen, I follow what's happening in the United States because I find it very painful. And I see so many scientists on television explaining the same things that we're hearing here in Europe. And the controversy, to discredit them, it's very hard to watch. And of course, it impacts people I care about.
You mentioned the turn of events in Israel, but in New York in particular, you had Governor Cuomo recently advise a notorious Hasidic sect, the Satmars, who are basically anti-Zionist, and advising them that no, they could not hold a wedding with 10,000 guests, and they should consider doing something in appropriate scale. My daughter lives not far from one of the Satmar settlements, as we call it here in the United States. It's called the community of Kiryat Joel in the Mid-Hudson Valley.
Yes, where the famous hydroxychloroquine doctor was.
That is correct. And it now has the highest spike in infections because they do not have the discipline or the concern about putting those yeshiva bachas essentially together in close quarters. And the surrounding community is quite concerned about the nature of that upsurge as well.
In a time where feelings have become fact, where rational thought and common sense has disappeared, one man stands above it all.
I'm Howie Sobiker, your political hitman.
Political Hitman airs every Tuesday at 11:59 p.m. North American time, 7 a.m. Israeli time, only on Israel News Talk Radio.
Are you interested in transforming your life, drawing closer to the Creator, and uncovering the deeper meanings and hidden treasures in the Hebrew Bible?
Then join me, Rav Yitzhak Michelson,
and me, William Hall,
on The Science of Kabbalah, where we are seeking to narrow the gap between what we understand of our physical and spiritual worlds. So make sure to tune in every Tuesday at 5 p.m. Israel time, 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, here on Israel News Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Beyond the Matrix, here on Israel News Talk Radio.
Governments, governments can't do what we say should be done in one fell swoop. A government can't do that because they have to modulate and be prepared for the counter punch that will come. So they do it by stages. But this is a definitive moment in the defense against Islam and jihad in France. And there is no talk of mentally unstable, nothing to do with Islam. No, I haven't heard it from anywhere.
So you would characterize this as a sea change in attitudes in France, or this has been percolating for a while?
It percolates, and then by stages, it reaches a new plateau, and then it percolates and reaches a new plateau. This is one very important plateau, and it's 20 years of exasperation. And French people, people are not used to violence in France. France is not a very violent society. And there's a great love of freedom and a great love of being out in your cities. This isn't a country where people want to close themselves inside. And so there's a tremendous opposition to this force that is trying to prevent us from living the French way.
Interesting. Someone who has been controversial in France and across Europe is Marine Le Pen of the National Front. How has she positioned herself in this development, particularly in light of the fact that you've got a presidential election coming up in 2 years?
Hardly anybody wants it to be a contest between Macron and Le Pen. She's practically useless. Her position is always predictable, and it's always very, shrill and harsh, and there's a whole impractical side to it. And the role that she carved out for herself is being chipped away because the mainstream is against the jihad, against the Islamization. So her position is not, it doesn't have the force that it had when she first started it. She can't govern, and people know that. And so her voice is not important.
So how has President Macron and his ministers handled this latest atrocity?
Like fighter jets that scramble when there's a plane coming in to bomb the Tour Eiffel. They're just busy everywhere. They had already been preparing some new laws, avoiding the question by calling it against separatism, but the crackdown on Islamization has been building. And now this incident is making it even stronger. But they're, I think, they're doing house searches. For example, to give you a more precise example, 80 people that or the authors of 80 messages in support of the killer, the Chechen that beheaded the teacher, now they're finding out who posted those messages, and they're going to all be called in for questioning, and they're going to be investigated. I think this is a very important step because those people thought that they were absolutely safe and completely out of danger in expressing this. And so they took, great pleasure in siding with the killer. They're going to be surprised now. There'll be hundreds of house searches and people called in for questioning. The issue of deporting people who are slated for deportation and not accepted by their country of origin. This question is boiling over the years. The Minister of the Interior was in Morocco the day that the professor was beheaded, trying to get the government to accept some 22 people that were being deported. Again, there's a call within the country for some kind of hard-headed or forceful, muscular policy with regard to these countries that send us these little punk jihadis and high-level jihadis and intermediate jihadis that will force them to take them back when they're deported. There's a lot of pressure in that direction, and there may be thousands of people that should be deported.
The irony is this heinous crime occurred during the Charlie Hebdo trial that involves the murders of 12 editorial staff and 4 hostages at the Kosher supermarket back in January of 2015, over 5 years ago. So what was revealed in the testimony, particularly of the Jewish hostages at the trial?
I'm so sorry to tell you that I can't answer that. I wasn't able to follow it, not even in the media. I was working on other things. And when I work on something, I'm so concentrated on it. And I simply couldn't follow it. So I know from the little that I saw that it's all, blood-curdling to hear from these people. The whole trials are filmed, and so we'll eventually be able to see them. But I couldn't even follow the reports.
A machete attack by an 18-year-old Pakistani immigrant triggered by the Hebdo cartoons. In fact, I think it took place not too far from their editorial headquarters, the new ones. What prompted a visit by the French Interior Minister and other Macron government officials to a Jewish synagogue that weekend?
First of all, it was the former headquarters of Charlie Hebdo. They have now been moved to a secret location.
Correct.
The people that were attacked were downstairs smoking a cigarette, and they worked for a production company that was in those offices when the Charlie Hebdo staff was massacred. Again, I'm sorry, I was following things more on your side of the Atlantic at that time, and I don't know about the visit to the synagogue. Do you know anything more than that?
Well, apparently it was done pretty close to Yom Kippur, and it basically involved the Interior Minister and several others on Macron's staff, I think to tell the French community, whether it was the consistory, the so-called CRIF in France, and others.
No, the consistoire and the CRIF are two different things. Consistoire is religious. CRIF is like the Conference of the Presidents of the major Jewish organizations.
That's correct.
Yeah.
To communicate a message to them that they were vitally concerned about the rise of Jewish anti-Semitism.
Yes, so then it must be that in that context, if one guy attacks where he thought, he wasn't that bright, right? He didn't know that he moved. He thought he was in front of their offices. That since the Charlie Hebdo massacre was followed by the Hyper Cacher massacre, hostage and massacre, I suppose that was the intention. And the interesting thing is this man, who was in fact 25, got accepted as an unaccompanied minor when he came to France. The killer, the Pakistani that attacked those two people, he didn't kill them, he attacked them with a butcher cleaver, meat cleaver. And the department that's in charge of taking care of these unaccompanied minors said that they didn't think he was under 18. And so he went before a judge, and the judge said, no, it's okay. this is another issue that the whole society is up in arms about, allowing these so-called minors to roam free and take advantage of the asylum policy.
This summer, there were also some trials, but they involved essentially the murders of Jews in France. And here I speak of not only a retired teacher, Muriel Knoll, but also Sarah Halimi. And going back in time, there, of course, was the start of a bow wave of Jewish Aliyah that occurred after the Toulouse attacks in 2012. I wonder if you could explain.
Okay, Mireille Knoll was in her 80s. She had escaped with her mother because her mother had a Brazilian passport, so they didn't get caught in the Rafle du Veldiv, that big roundup in July of 1942. Sarah Halimi was a pediatrician. She wasn't a teacher, she was a pediatrician, but she set up Jewish nursery schools connected to a synagogue. In this case, it's not the trial. This is a whole series of hearings because the lawyers defending the Halimi family want a killer to be tried in criminal court.
Where can you get the inside news on Israel? At Israel News Talk Radio, we're dedicated to sharing Israel's inside story with the world by providing our listeners with news on Israeli politics, current affairs, and Israeli Jewish culture. The Israel News Talk Radio homepage also provides you, the listener, with useful information at your fingertips, with scrolling news headlines, weather, currency exchange, Shabbat candlelighting times, and so much more. Our radio programming is always accessible and on demand. We operate absolutely free of charge for everyone, everywhere. If you love what we do, partner with us now by becoming an Israel News Talk Radio supporter. With your support, you'll be inscribed on our Israel News Talk Radio Wall of Fame. There's nothing like us in the world. Be part of something great. Israel News Talk Radio. Straight talk from Israel.
Howdy, this is Rita from League City, Texas, now living in Israel. And though my heart may have belonged to Texas, it now belongs to Israel and all the fantastic show hosts at Israel News Talk Radio.
Hi, this is Michael Solomon from Kiryat Arba, Israel. And why do I love listening to Israel News Talk Radio? Because I love listening to the interesting interviews they do and their news reporting that most other media sources don't cover.
Hey, this is Nicoleko from Malmö, Sweden. It gets pretty cold here in Sweden, so I love cuddling up with a warm cup of tea while I listen to Israel News Talk Radio.
Hey everybody, this is Frank Morris from Tennessee. Me and my dog Buster really love listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
News, opinion, and more. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.